like to see if I could go a little further with exactly what you're talking about, a L'Abri type of environment.
Mhm.
And I'm associated with a much smaller town further north of here that we've gone to in the summer over many years. And it has a deep religious quality to it. In terms of it attracted people from Princeton Theological Seminary years ago. So you had these little cabins in by a lake, but you also have these smaller cabins where people would go to write their sermons.
Right.
And they're called think houses, right? So just being in a smaller community, because I know from one of my siblings that a smaller community makes things happen more easily sometimes.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Byrne Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia. An overcast day, but that's good. Keeps the weather cool so that this Alaskan can survive the summer here. And today we've got another of our Anadromist dialogues. Anadromous, for those of you who are new to the channel for some reason, it means swimming against the stream like salmon do when they go upriver to spawn, to go home and die. That's what we're all doing, isn't it? Trying to get home and then die and spawn. So today we've got someone who's been a friend of the channel for quite a while, Laura Hartigan. And she is from New Jersey, New York City metro area. And she has been on the channel and contributing, as you could do. By the way, if you wish to contribute to the channel, there is a PayPal link below. Also, if you give more than $50 at one go or $10 a month through the PayPal link, I will send you at least 10 hours of audio extras. And you could, if you don't have any money, you can just like the video, subscribe. You could even share my videos. And I think you'll find this an interesting conversation. We will come back at the end and say our goodbyes and thank Laura for being with us. So, without any further ado, let's go talk to Laura. Are you there?
How are you?
I don't see you.
You will soon.
There you are. What? There. You're there. Your camera is better than mine. Are you using a webcam?
No, not at all. Just a year-old MacBook Air.
Oh, okay. Year-old. Mine's, shall we say, 10 years old.
Oh, really? Okay, that's it.
Yeah. So I've started recording, but if we say something at the beginning here that should be edited out, don't worry about it.
Okay.
And it's the same when we go through. If you say something and then upon reflection, it'll take me a day or two to
if upon reflection a family member might disown me, we'll
yeah. Well, sometimes we say something and then we go, oh, well, and you just kind of do that. Well, it's good to see you again.
Nice.
And I was just looking. You've never been on Paul's channel, have you?
No. I've actually, this is the first interview I've done on YouTube. I'm just saying, I think we comment, and you obviously have a YouTube channel, but we also comment on the same people. We're interested in the same.
Right. Well, also, obviously, we've talked on video chat before. So, and although I think that was Skype last time, I don't remember, but could have been Skype, could have been Zoom. I use both interactively.
Right. Yeah. And when you mentioned L'Abri in your first conversation with Paul Vanderklay, that's what piqued my interest. That's what kept me coming back to you and your channel.
Right. So you have two different last names, one for
Yes.
YouTube, one for Twitter. Which one do you prefer?
Hartigan.
Hartigan. Fine. I'll use that then. So anyway, you're in or near New York City?
Yes, I'm in a suburb of New York City.
Which one?
Montclair, New Jersey.
Montclair, New Jersey. That's not like right on the river, is it? That's like a little bit further.
No, it's 12 miles west. You get out of the tunnel
Yeah.
and you go 12 miles west on Route 3.
Yeah. I think I've been there before. I used to pick up and deliver art to different places in New York City.
It's a big arts community. There's a museum here. In fact,
So I got around everywhere. So I remember Montclair. Yeah. Okay. So you're going to have to go deliver that today. Okay. Where is that? And I remember a lot of places like that.
Right.
So since no one knows who you are, well, I mean,
I am someone who is very interested in community. And I think that's the major theme.
Right.
I just graduated with a master's in theology. I ended with a paper where I discuss St. Paul's vision of unity and how different it is from our understanding of unity. So I feel like what's been interesting about following you, following various other people's like Jonathan Pajot, obviously Paul Vanderklay, who I've already mentioned, Paul Kingsnorth, Harrington, Tom Holland, it's a community I couldn't find academically or in my town.
Right.
So searching for community, having community, coming from a community, it was a whole new world. And I found it very satisfying to hear things discussed that I hadn't heard discussed anywhere else.
And you're Catholic, right? Roman Catholic?
Yeah, I'm Catholic, although I was raised Catholic, and then in college I was, went on my search.
Right.
So with the Unitarians, went to a Presbyterian church, went to an Episcopal church. My husband was Congregationalist. He'd been to L'Abri. So I feel like I have a sympathy and an understanding of Protestantism. And I love the synergy too.
Right. Well, why don't you share with us a little bit of your kind of both spiritual and intellectual journey? It's like you said you were raised Roman Catholic, but how was it in your teen years? And then it sounds like you drifted, and then you came back on some level. So give us a little bit of that history.
Well, I think it actually sort of goes back to the beginning, which is my parents are immigrants, right? So my father's Irish, my mother's Canadian. They met coming home both had gone to a trip to Europe to visit their relatives. They're coming back into New York City and they meet and they marry. So they're immediately in Brooklyn, New York, which at the time was a very diverse, very interesting community. So even though I'm American, I was raised among, the Italians, the Swedish, the Jewish community. That was
what part of Brooklyn?
Bay Ridge.
Okay.
And then very much of an Irish community, right? My uncle was the pastor at the parish church. So I was baptized by my uncle.
Okay.
So very rich community. But like a lot of immigrants, all of a sudden they wanted to switch to a community that had a better school system. So it was taken from this rich, diverse community. And then I was put in it was a Revolutionary War era town. It was very conservative. Everyone went to one of 5 churches.
This is Montclair.
No. This is further out west. Okay. And I even though I was young when we made the transition, I think I was still looking for that diverse, rich community that I had. Right. Even though my switch to this other community had its benefits too. That school system my parents chose was remarkable, right? So I have no complaints about their decisions. It's just that you lose something when you move.
Right.
You gain something, but you lose something.
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Well, when I was young, like 7 years old, we moved from Hawaii to California in the middle of the school year. And one thing I've always told people whenever they think they're going to move, I said, do not do it for your children in the middle of the school year. If you can at all help it, don't do that, because it's a weird thing. You survive, but you're forever kind of like the new person.
Right.
In that area.
Right. My sister had that experience. Yeah. I did not, because I was 5 when we moved. So it was just like no school, then school.
Right.
Yeah. So I just, but faith is always part, right? I mean, the family is just based around faith. One of the things I find so interesting that my father's now deceased, but when we were younger, we could go many, many years without going to Ireland. But when we would go to Ireland, in the village he grew up in, he could go to church, walk out of church, and catch up with tons of families that he knew.
Nice.
And this continued through his 70s, right? So he could go, over to Ireland in his 70s, hadn't seen someone for 8 years, and he'd know the whole lay of the land and all the families. So he had it in his mind that wherever he went, he sort of created that sort of community, because that's how he grew up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then you're in suburban America and your parents create community, but you start to realize at some point that this is not typical.
What? Their community?
Most people don't have that sense.
Yeah.
Of this cohesive community where people know each other.
Yeah, a lot has to do with what's already happened in a certain location, and also like if the Irish are more garrulous as they get along with each other. They're often Ireland held on to its traditional.
There's a little backstabbing that goes along with it.
Oh
too.
yeah. The Irish are famous for their traders as well as for their. And part of it was always keeping their head down under the British occupation, but you never knew who was going to sell you out to
Absolutely.
get ahead.
Yeah.
And but nevertheless, the Irish kept like folk traditions and such long after they had died out in England or in many other places. I mean, France, you in the middle of the 20th century, you could hardly find folk music anymore. Whereas in Ireland, I remember in the 1980s, you hear about, I was meeting all these folk performers who were coming through, but they had a lively, their connection with their communities through music was still very strong, which I always thought was a great thing. And I got to know the Irish in the New York area very well, though I'm not Irish, though my name sounds Irish. Byrne Power.
Right. It does, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember once I was at a Catholic church in California, and the parish priest came up to me and said, "So what county are you from?" And I said, "I don't know, Poland, Poland, Ukraine, Scotland's probably the closest, Norwegian, right. American mutt." But yeah, so in a sense, your father brought that kind of natural sense of community with him, it sounds like.
So wherever he went, he sort of created a community. My mother was somewhat like that too, and she certainly learned from him how to create community in whatever deficits she might have had, but she was the more Canadian reserved approach. There was a lot of tea parties.
Right. Yes, we're bringing the apple pie.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that part of my attraction to the internet is that I think when community breaks down, dialogue breaks down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so when I hear people speak on the internet with these fascinating dialogues, it's this idea that you don't have to exactly agree. You can sort of reason together, and you move the ball forward.
Right.
And I feel like in America.
When did you start discovering this kind of like online world in terms of this sort of thing?
Right. It was before Jordan Peterson. I was listening to Bishop Byrne and some of his earlier commentary, which was more arts focused. Mm-hmm. And then I did get onto the Jordan Peterson bandwagon. Right. I particularly loved his grit his grit psychology, which is, there isn't a lot of self-pity or room for self-pity.
Right.
And
well, I have an interesting take on that.
Okay.
How he got that, because I lived in Alaska for 22 years, and where he was in Alberta was not all the way up as far as I am, but about halfway up the province, in these small towns that are kind of the last stop before you're on the Alaskan highway. And I know from Alaskans, and I also know because I've met plenty of Canadians from the Yukon, that there is a certain kind of, you just got to do it for yourself. You can't be weak. You've got cold weather. You've got, in Alaska, it's like animals and stuff. Where he was from, it would still be this cold weather. And there he was more like a plains person. So there wasn't a lot of distractions as far as nature, and it just kind of breeds out of you the sort of mentality of, people should do things for me.
Right. There was actually a physical reality you had to contend with.
Yeah. Nobody in Alaska that I knew was particularly reliant on, on the government for things. There were government programs and whatnot, but people prided themselves on their ability to, make friends, but also everyone kind of had a place. So, I was teaching homeschool kids about music and media, but they were doing things like helping me build a coffin for my mother. So that, but
how intimate is that?
Exactly. And, it's, to me, that's a community. We don't all have, the Bible says, how is it when you get together? Everyone has something different, you see. And what a lot of people do is they want to get together with people who do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that's very different, I think. But there's a benefit to, academics getting together, people of a certain trade or a certain profession getting together, like-minded individuals. But I think a good community has to have these other factors in it, which is one of the points I made. You probably watched my community video that I did a few weeks back.
Right. No, I think the community, and there was a really good Grail Country video on community. Mm-hmm. That I enjoyed as well. I think that there is a need for community that is not about all thinking the same.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, in my most recent question and answer, someone asked me, what do you think about how can I have a community in the small town? To which I said, that's easy. You already got a lot of stuff already done for you because you're in a small town. But also, when we think about alternatives to the alienated way we live these days, and one of the things I always thought was when I was living in Switzerland back in the late 1970s, the first time, it occurred to me, if I could stay here, I would. If I could stay in Switzerland, I would. Mm-hmm. But you couldn't. They were very tight about, I think at that time it was 3 months. It's still 3 months, but now you can't even go next door to France because they're all in the Schengen group. You have to go as far as like the UK to stay there in the Europe longer. Whereas Georgia, on the other hand, is 365 days. You can just tag Armenia, come back, and it's 365 more days.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So for me, that's a much better scenario. And in fact, I've started kind of gathering more. I'm very deliberate. I have a friend here who's really gregarious and goes around, makes friends with all these people. He's always telling me, oh, I met this person as a filmmaker and I met this person. I'm like, okay, that's really good. But that's not how I operate. I go for, okay, this person, good, solid. This person, good, solid. And I just keep adding more really solid people. I'm less interested in, I happen to know a fair amount of people to different degrees, obviously.
Right.
But I just found, for instance, I didn't just find them. I was introduced to them like 2 years ago, but I've gotten to know them better. There's a pair of sisters who are both Orthodox, and they're around 28, 30, something like that, years old. Mm-hmm. Absolutely amazing and as thinkers, they're amazing.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so probably thinkers. That would be your attraction.
Yeah. Well, they're thinkers, but no, one of them is a principal dancer for one of the ballet companies here. And she's an incredible dancer. And she says, I don't read much. And yet you talk to her and she's just incredibly knowledgeable, not so much about all the events of the world as to the meaning of things. And her sister is even frighteningly more so. And so I actually said to them, hey, would you mind if I interview you, come over to my house and we can do an interview here? And they said, yeah. And in fact, one sister said, I was thinking about doing a YouTube thing. And I said, great, because I think the world should meet these people because their whole perspective is so different than ours. And yet at the same time, it's very cohesive and strong. I mean, and I've met several people like that here who are Orthodox, but even the ones who aren't, they just have a very different take on things. And it's no crime to start getting involved in a very deep discussion with these people. And I have several other Georgians who actually some guy came up to me. This was from my Georgian Crossroads channel like a week and a half ago and said, wait a minute, I recognize you. And I looked at him, I go, yeah, did I meet you somewhere? And he goes, no, you have a YouTube channel. I said, oh, that's cool. And but there's actually a Georgian guy here who started with my Georgian Crossroads channel and then graduated to the Anadromist channel. And he's obviously been thinking about things too. And so I'm saying, okay, we're getting more than a handful of people here. That's where to me, it's like many of the best things have happened because it's not because of movements. It's because of people willing to commit themselves or just simply being committed to themselves in a certain way. Right. Like you think about the Inklings and they didn't have a charter or anything. They didn't all sign a piece of paper saying, I'm an Inkling, I promise to, there's no. But
there was a commitment to dialogue. I mean,
exactly. And a lot of the glue was C.S. Lewis, obviously, because he was the one who kind of facilitated things, although it wasn't just him by any means.
Right.
But when you think of all the things that have happened because of the various Inklings, you just say to yourself, wow, that's pretty amazing.
Right. And they're frequently having second lives. If you take the.
Yeah. Well, I was.
The Lord of the Rings trilogy movies to I've certainly listened to a lot of lectures on Owen Barfield recently.
Right.
C.S. Lewis seems to be a perennial that comes up in a lot of spaces.
Yeah, well, C.S. Lewis has just continued, and there'll be little spikes, but basically what's interesting, I've seen his work go from being like, this guy, C.S. Lewis, you'd read about him in little footnotes here and there, to being like a major figure from the 20th century, and not just in Christianity, but of many of his ideas as well, which of course I think is the way it always should have been. But
right. So so that's why my ear perked up when you said you'd been at L'Abri and you'd had a commitment to L'Abri, and I listened to some of the lectures that you gave at L'Abri, and I listened to Hans Ruckmacher that you had referred me to, and I just thought, well, this is a whole interesting avenue. But since my husband attended L'Abri or worked at L'Abri, however you want to say it, in Switzerland and also in Massachusetts, and his friends that he met there are particularly, they're autodidacts. Mm-hmm. They are deeply interested in culture and faith.
What year did he go there?
He went there in 1983. And then, of course, he was there in Switzerland and he was in Massachusetts, probably 1984, 1985.
Right. So I didn't meet him because I was there 78, 79. Then I didn't come back again until 87. And then it wasn't until 93 that I started doing much more regular return trips. But yeah. In Paul van der Klee, his development of his estuary ideas seems very similar to me, although obviously a completely different platform because L'Abri was a physical space. Right.
And of course, the other part of it is that you have to contribute in work and you dine together. So
well, I consider the eating together to probably be the centerpiece, actually, more than the lectures, more than the working together, although the working together, those three things together right there are very much form a whole. And
but the eating together is definitely the relationship to community and the youth.
Well, yeah, that's what welds everyone together. And right. I learned that from them, so that later in life, when I was in New York or Alaska, I would regularly hold what I never called them parties, because party has a certain connotation. I would call them feasts, which would then, when people would come over, and in Alaska, it was interesting. I did quite a few, many more than in New York City. And I would do things like, I had friends who would give me strange meats. And by strange meats, I don't mean like, duck or goat. I mean like seal meat.
Right.
Or brown bear meat, which you're never supposed to eat because it's always so fishy, but a brown bear wandered onto someone's property before the fish had come in. And so they gave me a roast from it, and I invited my friends because they were all like, yeah, I've never had brown bear meat, and we've had black bear meat. But
you have, like you said, these feasts, and you have these exchanges of ideas over good food, and it's just a transformative experience, right?
Yeah. And
I think that's sort of liturgy is supposed to teach you, is you come together over something.
Yeah. I'm hoping, one of the problems I see with the churches is that they've allowed technology to come in through the wrong doors. And that is to say, through music, through projections of screens, through, I get even more frustrated with.
I'm with you on that. We totally agree.
Yeah, I'm even more frustrated that the teaching is done by courses on videotape. Because I say to myself, hey, I would love it if you would take my videos and watch them and use them for something like that. But actually, no, because I would much rather someone there be educated enough and get educated and know how to teach and research something.
Well,
I think
even lighting has been a problem, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Brightly lit churches as opposed to candles and a feeling of entering a mysterious space just disappears.
Yeah, well, that's one thing the Georgian Orthodox Church, and I think most Orthodox churches have. When you walk into a Georgian Orthodox church, it is dark. They have candles at night. But they've even allowed the amplifier and such to come in, and so that you can hear the prayers from outside and such, which I think is like, okay, it's a bit much, but it's hard because people have gotten used to. I mean, I remember once in New York City, this wasn't at a church, this was at a folk club, and the folk club was about the size of the room behind me, which is bigger than it looks in the screen, but it's pretty wide and long. But there isn't anyone who couldn't sing a song and fill that space without a microphone. And they had an amplification system in this teeny space. And I was just like, what are you doing? Why do we feel the need? And I've seen this with churches quite often, that they'll have an amplifier because people don't understand technology. And it's not to say that I'm against amplifiers. I'm just saying you have to understand what it does. It changes everything. So there is a place where you want to communicate to a wider group of people. But once you take that away, it's now more intimate. So for instance, most of my puppet shows had no amplification whatsoever because I wanted to draw people in towards the puppets. I wanted them to, and we always had live music, no amplification. So we had a guy playing a kind of a harmonium. Later, we developed more music and such. But for me, I understand what happens with the mediation of amplification and microphones. And that is what it does is it tends to take the whatever is amplified and make it more important than what isn't. Where if you want a community, you have to pull some of that away.
Yeah, and that's actually something I grew up as well, was my Latvian uncle playing the mandolin.
Yeah.
Right, at family gatherings,
right.
Or my uncle and father singing old ballads together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And it's just a completely different experience. And then when you would go to church, it would be, much more formal, at least in my understanding. But now, I mean, one of the worst things that I thought came in as a Catholic was the folk mass.
Right. I understand that. And
Yeah.
I have some old records from the middle of the 1960s that were Catholic folk masses and such. And it's not that the music is terrible, not by later standards, but it's that it becomes. I don't think that Catholic mass is supposed to be folksy.
No, it did not. It was like this was not working. Cross purposes, right?
Right. I think it's supposed to. I mean, one of the strengths of the Catholic Church, one of the problems I see in Protestantism, is that the Protestants gave up the mystery of the faith. For it seems to be a battle on one side and the other. One side, it's kind of like the mystery and holiness of God, and the other side is the inclusion of more people. And the microphone is part of the inclusion side.
Right.
What's interesting about the Georgian Orthodox Church is you go in, there's nobody singing except the people who are singing. That is to say, the actual singers who have literally raised goosebumps on my flesh because it's just so beautiful.
Right.
So, yeah. And
how does this work for you, Byrne? How does the Protestant and the Orthodox work? Is it?
Oh, well, you see,
is it a merger?
I'm a weird Protestant. And that is to say, I became a Christian in the Jesus movement.
Right.
So that was like being in the Wild West,
literally,
of faith. Most of the people I knew, their stories weren't something like I grew up as a Christian and faded away, although there was a certain amount of that. Right. But many of them were, I came to San Francisco looking for the hippie dream and taking drugs and stuff. And then it all turned into a nightmare. And then I heard the word and became a Christian. And many of them had little connection to Christianity before that. I even had one friend who became a Christian. He'd come from Massachusetts. He was kind of a Catholic, kind of fell away from that, but pretty young, Irish Catholic guy. And then ended up, he was Boston, very much a Southie type. And then ended up in San Francisco doing drugs, just acting like a fool. But this was like 3 years after the hippie gold rush in 1967. And then he ended up joining the Children of God movement.
Right.
Which is one of the weirder cults to come out. And yet at the same time, they emphasized certain things in Christianity which were true. Then he ended up somehow on the Jesus People commune I was on. And I was only 17 years old at the time. So everyone I met had these weird stories like this. One guy was in the Hare Krishna movement. Most of them told me horror stories about drugs and stuff, enough to keep me away from drugs for the rest of my life. We had one guy we called Speed Freak Ray. And the poor guy had done so much meth and stuff that he was just talking like this all the time because his nerves had been destroyed,
Right.
But being in that, for instance, the way our group left was, the way it operated was that we were, what should I say? We didn't, for the first few years, we didn't have a Sunday morning service. And we were told to go to any church you want. So we kind of looked at them all as part of the same thing. We didn't look at them as like the Catholic Church and such. And so we had some people, for instance, I was going to high school for a while there, and I had other friends going to another high school who were Catholic, and I had other friends, who were Baptist, and other friends who were Pentecostal. So I've retained that. And
I think that's worth retaining because we are all part of the same body, right?
Yeah.
Always, this internet dialogue is I think, reknitting part of it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things in the Orthodox tradition is they're very clearly like there's only one church.
Right.
And the Catholics are a
No,
little
you have the
dodgy.
Catholic too. Yes.
The Catholics are kind of dodgy. We could reunite with them, but then they look beyond the Catholics and they see that mess of Protestants on the other side, and they're like, no. They don't understand that at all. But part of it is they've got the Catholic Church in the way. And so they don't really understand what happened over there. And they'll say something like, there's only one church. And I go like, yeah, I agree. But of course, I'm saying it in a different way.
Right.
I'm saying it to include everyone who's part of the body of Christ, because ultimately they all come out of the same thing. Now, the question is interpretations, and, the Protestants certainly have some very, very big faults, and they have been peculiarly, what should I say, vulnerable to various modernist tendencies and postmodernist tendencies because they believe too much in the individual.
Right.
And
but what was interesting when, being in a Catholic theology program is we read a lot of Protestant theologians, and we weren't reading them saying, oh, we are in opposition to this position. It was in dialogue and frequently like, doesn't this illuminate something? Right. So I actually would be curious if the same thing goes on in Protestant seminaries. If they're exposed.
It really depends on which branch. And one thing that a lot of people don't understand, we often use the phrase liberal and conservative in political circles to mean one thing, but in Christian circles, it's actually very different than that. So the most conservative would be Orthodox, then Catholic, then maybe Lutherans and various Reformed and Presbyterian groups, and then Methodists, Baptists, and then eventually you get to Pentecostals, and Holiness Pentecostal, then finally just weird independent charismatics and stuff. And you look at this group and you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, who, Anglicans would probably be right after Catholics, in between Lutherans and such, depending on the Anglican style.
Yeah, right. No, certainly where I am, Anglicans or the Episcopal Church is quite low.
But what that doesn't tell you is it doesn't tell you anything about their politics.
No, it's liturgical.
No, but conservative means how liturgical, how connected to the original modus operandi of the church.
Yeah.
Whereas you can get down here to Pentecostal groups who basically not only do they not care about the authority of the church, they're a little skeptical about whether the Bible works without the Holy Spirit. In other words, for them, it's like being filled with the Holy Spirit in the moment that's more important, because that determines how you will interpret the Bible. So you essentially you're going from order to total anarchy within the Christian church. However, politically, the person down at this end might be an absolute political conservative. And the person down here in certain liberal wings of the Catholic Church, certainly in the Anglican Church and a lot of the mainstream Protestant churches, they could be very liberal politically. So it's a very weird thing. And a lot of people don't understand that dynamic. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that how I deal with the Orthodox Church here is kind of like, it's I would say I'm more accepting of them than to them. I'm some sort of strange. They don't know what to do with me. And my friends, I did consider it a small bit of victory when I was telling you about the two sisters. And last time we talked, they were very much like, you have to become Orthodox. This time they said they were. I remember one of the sisters, Anna, was talking, and she said, for Orthodox people, and then she stopped and goes, Christian people. And I said, great, because that included me. Not that I care. I mean, I do, but I don't. That is to say, it's like if someone says you're not a Christian, I'm like, okay, whatever. But
right.
You can say what you want.
So I have a question for you. Where do you think this internet dialogue is going with regards to Christianity, or
Do you know about the conference coming up in Germany?
I do.
I'm actually doing a
What's the
dialogue.
date of that?
August 26th through 28th.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm doing an interview with Matthew Bergman, Matthias Bergman, this week, actually, later this week, which I'll put on. But it's all about introducing the concept to people, because I really feel, I like what Paul's doing with the estuary thing. I think it's just one of many ways we can work it out, because the main thing for me is to get this offline, and we can keep it online too, get it offline, because we need these things in reality. We need to touch.
That's exactly where I'm heading. I'm trying, now that I graduated, it's like, what's the next step? And I want it to be in an embodied, meeting, right? Of dialogue. Right.
Yeah. So there is this thing going on. Paul's actually at a conference right now in Chicago. And then coming up in early August, there is this thing with Paul and Jonathan Peugeot up in Thunder Bay, Ontario, wherever that is, and probably along something on Lake Superior.
Yeah.
But I got invited to come to the one in Germany.
Right.
So Paul will be there too. So I'm finally I get to meet Paul. Because as much as I like these conversations, I don't really consider that I know someone until I actually meet them in the flesh.
You really don't. Yeah. And there was also a very similar conference run at Maynooth College, which is actually a pontifical college in Ireland, called the Future of Christian Thinking.
Right.
And this was much higher level, but it's like theologians from different disciplines all getting together. And there seems to be this interesting melding of East and West going on right now as well. Well, actually, I'm eventually going to do some kind of video that, these are the worst of times. They're also the best of times. They are the best of times.
And because we have, right now, there are possibilities that didn't exist 10 years ago, didn't exist 40 years ago. And it's being facilitated by these internet connections, but it's also facilitated by the fact that the people who have been dominating the cultural conversation have pushed it so far to the edge of insanity, in the guise of
something that Barry Harrington is very good at pointing out, right?
Yes, exactly.
Edge of insanity. Yeah.
But here's the weird thing: is there's people. I mean, when I look at the people that I pay attention to, they run the gamut of people: Catholics, Orthodox, various kinds of Protestants, but also gay, lesbian. There are even trans people who are like, what is going on here? But then there are atheists. And then there are people like Tim Pool, who, when I first started listening to him, he's like, yeah, I'm not so sure if there's a God. But now he's going, yeah, there's a God, but I don't know how to define it. And
well, try and define God as a lifetime practice.
Right. But what it is I feel like, someone like Douglas Murray is a very interesting example, because he's gay, but he's also conservative. He is not religious, and yet he has all the respect in the world for religion. And
so the internet has opened up a space for people to actually be these unusual combinations.
And what's interesting is also to have dialogue where, in the best circumstances, there is room for real disagreement and argumentation. Now, in the worst are on the fringes, and they're on the right fringes and on the left fringes. And these are the people, I've occasionally...
They can't discuss things.
No.
It's rigidity, right?
Yeah. And I feel like, but I'm calling it right now the radical center, for lack of a better word, but it's kind of like, it's people that go from...
I finally get to be a radical.
Yeah. Well, it's people from center left, center right, in between, non-aligned, look at just the people who show up on my or Paul's channels occasionally, like someone like Julian the Hutterite. It's just like, that's amazing, but then I just talked to Jonathan Peugeot. And then, but also there's people like Griswold Grimm who are like, you can't define him, but he's basically a video gamer who's, I'm sure, done his share of substances and such. I often...
Here's another paradox. Like you, Paul Kingsnorth, a few other people I follow are really into, like you said, in person, sort of having technology in its place. And yet all of this is facilitated by technology.
Yeah. Well, I keep a real rein on.
You do. Yes, you have to.
This is one of the ways I keep the rein on.
Yes.
This is just when I go out, apart from the odd text or even rarer phone call, all of which do happen from time to time, I don't have to worry about notifications. And when I'm not here, I'm not here. When I'm walking, I'm walking. I'm not in the middle of this thing that's constantly, I don't have to keep tapping to figure out, oh, I got to reply to this right now. No, I don't.
Yeah.
There's very little in life.
The seduction. So having a non-smartphone actually really helps. Like I tend not to bring my phone places, when I go for a walk, but it drives other people crazy that I'm not reachable.
Oh, exactly. No, when I lived in New York in the beginning of the 1980s, I drove people insane because not only did I, there were no smartphones. I didn't even have a phone. But I would go to phone booths and call people. And many people were saying, Byrne, it's not fair. You can call us, but we can't call you. And I was like, So eventually I got a phone. But I didn't have use for it and I often wish they would invent a phone jammer for your house, because there are times would it be nice to just like you have people over, just jam all their phones so we can talk. And so people don't get taken out of the presence of each other into what? I've got to talk with someone, I wanted to do something in Dubuque, Iowa today. I need to contact this person. And my feeling is,
when my kids were little, I had something called Technology Free August, which was a really interesting experience because you'd pull the plug on all their little gizmos, which were not like they are today, because my kids are in their mid to late 20s.
Right.
So they would go through, especially one of my children would go through a withdrawal period.
Sure.
And then all of a sudden their imaginative play would bubble up to the top. They were still doing imaginative play beforehand, but it bubbled up to a whole different level.
It's got to. That's the thing.
And develop social skills that they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Right.
So.
Right. And I often feel our over-reliance on technology tends to, it's like we're not getting certain kinds of socio-cultural vitamins or spiritual vitamins that you would get. I learned this in New York a long time ago. I remember people saying, yeah, you really can't see God in nature. And I'm going like, yeah, when was the last time you were actually in nature? Everything you see. If I go to upstate New York to what is it? There was one of the parks is Bear Mountain Park. And I remember going up there with a friend, with some friends, and everywhere we got out, there was like trash. And I'd be hiking up the side of a hill randomly. And everywhere I go, there'd be trash. And I was saying well, this isn't nature. So we went in further and we went to another place. It was this beautiful little waterfall. And there were condoms on the ground and beer cans and everything. And I'm just going like, when I eventually moved to Alaska because I wanted to get the real thing. Because if you walk, 20 yards off the road in Alaska, you start thinking about bears and moose, and that changes everything.
Yes, we're headed tomorrow to a place very far north, and the bears will be about.
Yeah. And we need that sort of thing.
Important. Yeah. It's important to remember that the real world nature exists, right?
Well, yeah, because we are made to interact with it. I think creativity comes from, a lot of people in the postmodern sphere say, well, art is just a comment on art, is just a comment on art, to which I'm saying you're an absolute idiot, because art is it made in relationship to the stuff, literal stuff of life that we move into. Every culture that has art or music or everything starts with what's in their geographic locality. It starts with the wood that's there. It starts with the rock that's there. It starts with the sound of the cows, or it starts with the geography. And that's one of the things that's happened to us, is we've become dislocated from geography. So we don't know where we are. And Americans, when we take vacations, we tend to go for a couple of weeks somewhere, which is just like skimming across the top of someone else's reality. And I try to, to the degree possible, push for people to take longer vacations just to get to know things. It's like what bookmarkers are.
My relatives who would come from Europe to visit when I was little, it was a fortnight, right?
Yeah.
2 weeks would have been too short.
Right. Exactly.
So you had people show, and people expected to visit.
Yeah.
There was sightseeing involved, too many circle lines around Manhattan, I can tell you that. But there was also a tremendous amount of visiting where they just shared what was going on in their lives.
Well, also when you see people you haven't seen for a while, first things you're going to share are the news of the day kind of things. Oh, they just had a baby. So-and-so's just graduated. We had problems with our car, this sort of stuff.
Right.
It's only as you keep talking that you get to the underlying things. And you need to take separate walks with different people and do maybe a bit of work with someone. And then you start getting involved with what's really going on with them. Because very few people will tell you the absolute truth the second you meet them.
Absolutely. And you can't expect them to. Why would they reveal their vulnerabilities to someone right?
Yeah. You wouldn't go to someone's house, be there for an extended weekend, and they tell you I really don't know if I can make it in this marriage. They won't, unless they've already kind of made up their mind that it's over, right. But as far as actually getting any real advice and the kind of underlying doubts that everyone has about life.
Absolutely. People are struggling through difficulties, there's little respites, but a lot of life is struggle. Did I lose you?
No. I had some little technological thing. The recording from the last session just told me we're done. I'm going, great.
Okay. So, it's true. So community takes time to develop too.
Or so maybe not. Hold on one second here. Did I? I may have done something stupid. And I don't know. Okay. I know where it went. It's somewhere else. If I miss the first half, we at least have the second. So I don't worry about these things. So
right, you can't.
No. And that's exactly the thing. I could right now get really involved with thinking, what did that mean? Where did that go? But instead, it's just like, no, this is more important.
Right.
So
Georgia, I've also, since I have EU citizenship through my dad,
right.
One of my children is in Europe. I've toyed with going, doing the reverse immigration. But you have certainly presented a picture where there are some really, exceptional things in Georgian culture now that exist that you can't find easily other places.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And I appreciate it here a lot. I also happen to end up in a place here that is one of I just ended up in this block. And I don't think this was just my own doing here. I ended up on this block that literally I'm next to all of these things that make life really interesting. That is to say that, the big, not only are there two huge grocery stores a minute from me where I can find literally a minute walk, and yet they don't, where I am here, I don't see them at all. So it's not like I'm in the middle of a commercial zone.
Right. And the place you're living at least seeing it over the internet, doesn't look like it's devoid of character. It looks like it's full of character, which I'm sure some of the places in Georgia are like, Soviet monstrosities, right?
Yeah, but even those are quite interesting. That is to say, because people do really weird things to the buildings. So let's say you have a balcony and it's got, metal roof, not roof's the wrong word. It's got grill work around the side, a fence to keep you in. People go out and literally build on that balcony and make an extra room out of it. And then and I've looked at some buildings, they're like 12, 15 stories tall, and you look on the outside of the building, and it's all different kinds of textures of paint or brick or whatever. People just simply, and in one sense, it's like, well, jeepers, that could be dangerous. And in another sense, I kind of like the kind of patchwork nature of the whole thing.
Right. New York City is increasingly, populated by these strange cubes.
Right.
Like you said, the glass wall, the lack of decoration, and it's interspersed with things.
Well, that kind of architecture is here too. And I've been thinking that how did we end up here? And I've really been thinking about how we ended up here. And what
we're spending so much time looking at a flat screen.
Yeah. But also that comes from, there was a guy named, I think it was Alfred Loos, Loos, at the beginning of the 20th century, who wrote an essay called Ornament as Crime.
That was a provocative title.
Well, yes. And he was thinking about all of the things related to, Victorian ornamentation, Art Nouveau. But, and so he came up with, before there was Bauhaus, he wrote this essay. And in the essay, he's basically saying, we don't need any ornamentation for daily practical things, which includes houses, chairs, kitchen, utilities and whatnot. And what's odd is I have a couple of books now that I've gotten since I've been here, had them sent to me, about ornamentation. And every culture has had some kind of ornamentation. Mm-hmm. And yet somehow this idea came along, and it's related to the egalitarian idea that there should be no special emphasis on something. And so they created these flat, dead spaces. And it's kind of like you go from Art Nouveau to then Art Deco, but there's still ornamentation. And in fact, Soviet architecture still has ornamentation, but it's losing it. But meanwhile, in the Bauhaus world, and by the time you get to the international style of architecture, it's just literally like girders, glass, cement, and that's it. And
but I think that even the early international style was probably more ornate.
Exactly.
What we're seeing now, right?
Yeah. What we're seeing now is, I often consider it the commercialized version of all that stuff, made with the cheapest materials. Right. And funded by mafia aesthetics. That is to say, essentially, the mafia figured a while ago, think of all the money you can make from materials on huge buildings. And so there's the architects over here who are all in their form follows function cult. Yes. So that, and they're going off of Loos, essentially saying, well, there shouldn't be any forms here that don't follow the function.
Right. Although there's also a trend in New York too for such oddly shaped rooms, like.
And there's a building here that looks like this right next to me. Right. But of course, inside it's like this.
Right. It's like living inside a Picasso painting, right?
Right.
What's happening here?
Those are postmodern effects. The same principles are there. They're just clever. Like there's a twisty building next to me that goes like this. Two of them next to each other. One's black, one's white, which is at least a little interesting. But then you look across the street and there's another big one like this and people will say, "Oh, they're wonderful buildings." I'm going like, "No, they're not. They're wonderful if you look down at your city from an airplane. If you look at your city from the abstract, right. But if you look at them in the not abstract, actually living underneath these buildings, they don't feel wonderful. So my 7-8 story Soviet building that I'm living in here, with walls like this thick of just concrete. This was in the days when they were overbuilding.
Right.
1956. So it has much more character then if I cross the large avenue and then the two twisty buildings and the other one, and I'm like, I hope they never tear this building down, because this is a good building. It's not the best building. It's got a lot of, I wouldn't call this a work of art, but it's a solid building. It houses me,
Right.
But across the street are these clever postmodern buildings. And those things, and then besides that, people then just build some sort of flat, dead, a friend of mine pointed out, now they don't even put curves on buildings. It's just grid patterns, but it's cheap grid patterns,
Yeah. Well, we don't realize the effect that has on us either. It's like this feedback loop, right? Now, what is it like to look at dead spaces all the time? It's a little bit like that book that I read on your recommendation with Paul Virilio.
Which one did you read?
The Administration of Fear.
Yeah.
And just to, you could say that I was meant to read it because I brought it into Manhattan and I was not in one, but 2 car accidents that day.
Wow.
And the line was, the person who invented the car accident, and there they were.
Exactly.
They were not serious, but it sort of speaks to the fact that New York cab drivers need to take
right
more care. But it was sort of like, okay, I think I was meant to read this book.
Right.
About the passage of time. It was really fascinating, and he writes in an unusual style.
Yeah.
That's very approachable.
Yeah, he also wrote a little book called The Information Bomb, which I highly recommend, because it's about, he says there were 3 different bombs that have gone off, and one is the information bomb. That's the first one. And so, yeah, and he lived long enough into...
Is that the printing press, or is that something else?
No, he's talking about this. He lived long enough into the digital age to see the proliferation. It's like a chaos of information that comes at us.
Yes.
And what it does is I think this is part of the reason why people have been so confused. If you were in a society where everything was more or less, okay, we know this, we know that, Berlin 300 years ago wasn't that big a society. Most of Western, most places where we consider so much of our classical art came from, classical music, were places like Vienna or Salzburg or Prague, which were not huge cities with big suburbs at those times when the art was made. So there was a sense that there was a structure of life that was...
And classical music also incorporates a lot of folk.
Motifs. And but so does everything, in a sense. Art, poetry, dance, all of these things have elements from them. But now we live in a time, in my own thought, if you followed my How We Got Here series, we essentially, sometime near the end of the millennium, we arrived at the point of pure chaos when it comes to, Times Square is a great example. You go there and it's just... and screens are talking and moving, and it's a bit like Blade Runner, but a lot less moody, just more chaotic, just kind of overwhelming. And it's all just commercial stuff and a few, and then, some big budget theater pieces for people to come spend their money on.
Right. And what does that chaos do to you?
Right.
What does it do to you internally?
Yeah. But that's what the internet does as well. Because it's Marshall McLuhan talks about the mosaic effect, and the newspapers had a mosaic effect where you had these lines running down with a photo and such. But compared to the internet, they just seem like so empty. Whereas the internet puts thing on top of thing on top of thing. So you're watching a video and you see something over here, you go, oh, I should watch that one, and then I should watch this one. Or you go to the Google News page, which has all the different news things, news stories of the day, but it's just like, but then you're going to another page, another page, another page. And after a while, all these things are just coming at you. So how do you distinguish what's real, what's not, what's true, what's not?
Right. Right. So and you've talked about this in terms of travel too, which really resonates with me because my parents were very much into taking boats and trains as opposed to whenever they could.
Yeah. Yeah.
And your experience, like going over the Atlantic slowly, or it felt slowly, well, actually it wasn't that slow, right? You know?
Yeah. Well,
which would have been a speedy trip compared to our ancestors, you know, a couple hundred years ago. But as opposed to getting in a tin can and ending up in another city 6 hours later.
Right.
I think it sort of shows, like when you see a person get off a boat, if you see a person get off a plane, it's a very different look.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The person coming off the plane does look more disoriented.
Well, yeah, and they don't know where they are. Literally, I mean, in Alaska, people would come when they'd come in the boat there, and they would literally be looking down at their phone, and there's a mountain here and a glacier over there, and they just walked off a fjord that's 1,500 feet deep, and there are going to be bears and whales if you keep looking, and they're looking down here. They don't see anything. They're still wherever they are when they go here.
Right.
This is a place, and it's not a very big place. And yet it's a chaotic place that always wants your attention.
Right. And I don't think we can be human in that chaotic place and not have it, I don't want to say destroy your soul, but it certainly doesn't help your soul.
So,
my goodness.
Yeah, well, I had light from outside, but I decided to shift to the artificial light now. But
one other overlap we had from years ago was I figured out that I just left my weekly trips to JNR Music World right before you started working there, right? In Lower Manhattan.
Okay. That's good. So, yeah. Well, that was a whole world. I mean, it's amazing how much, so you've been going to New York City for quite a while. So and if you remember that era, then you remember when there were more bookstores.
Oh, absolutely.
More little bookstores. There was a whole book row. Where was that book row? Was it on Broadway? Like between 12th and 14th or something like that. There was an area there that had little bookstores. I remember a few of them. They were going out. The Strand is the last bookstore from that area, that era. There was another one around.
You end up there, yeah.
Yeah, but it was a whole zone of used bookstores. Mm-hmm. And now I consider it a victory that there was a guy here in Georgia who kind of looked at me collecting books, getting them sent here and such, saying, why are you doing that? You can just read them all on the internet. I go, it's not the same thing. And most people don't read things on the internet. They skim because you just don't feel like looking at this thing or looking at this thing. And
if I'm going to read it, I'm going to print it out because you can't stare at it. Yeah.
Right. So, and I told him, plus a book is a very special thing. And a little bit later, about a year later, he told me, I've started buying books because of you. And I said, yes. That's a
victory.
Because we talk about caring for the world, but we can't care for the world if we don't even know how to care for an object, how to love an object. So it's a strange sort of world we've created for ourselves. And I was thinking about this because I follow some people who are digital nomads on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And they have hundreds of thousands of followers, which means this: they're traveling from place to place to place. They don't necessarily spend very long in the places they go to, just long enough to get videos. Sometimes they'll stay longer. And then when they want to communicate, they have to try to communicate to 250,000 people. How can you do that? It's very hard to communicate to 250,000 people. If my channel right now, I'm still at the point, I just hit 2,000 subscribers. I'm at the point where I can kind of still keep track of what's going on. But I can see 10,000 would make that a lot harder.
Right. So I think you pointed to something really interesting is like, where are the solutions to this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the solutions are back in physical reality, where to leave this where it is. This is the internet. but to meet people, to have dinners at your home, to find ways to gather people together. I think art definitely needs people who are willing. I mean, there used to be all these different movements, whether it's something like surrealism or symbolism or impressionism or Dada, or all these different art movements at different times. And in Holland in the 17th century, all these artists who were right near each other. And I'm not saying that the content of all these movements was necessarily always great, but the point is they were in some sense connected to each other, or in many cases, like, you'd have the Surrealist Manifesto, and you'd sign that and you became like a surrealist, which met in reality. You met in groups and you discussed things. You had a certain outlook. Where now that sort of thing, it doesn't happen in reality anymore. And I think this has opened some doors. But if this stays here, well, any sort of cultural changes that we need won't happen. Because they have to happen out here.
Yeah.
It's nice that I will eventually. I've been varnishing endless bookshelves today. I'm building three.
How's the library?
I'm building 3 11-foot tall bookshelves. I still have to get my Alaskan library, but world events are conspiring against me.
Yeah. Well,
so yeah, because the last stretch is through the Black Sea. Oh. Then the prices have gone up, and then I have to deal with customs here. So I kind of have to let Ukraine. It's like I say, okay, another year. But after spending the money here, for some reason, the wood here was ridiculously expensive. And but anyway, I was in the middle of like making these bookshelves, and I'd stained them, and now I was varnishing them. And I was in this room, and I had a fan blowing it up, but I walked out, and I'm like, where am I? Because it was like, this was not a friendly acrylic kind of, varnish or anything like that. This was serious oil-based stuff, which does strange things to your head after a while.
Oh, absolutely. Little fumes. Yeah.
But I said to myself, it's worth it to go through this. I've done this before in the past in order to have really beautiful bookshelves. So I'll put them over here. Probably by the next time anyone sees me, maybe in another week after that or so, I'll have these really great bookshelves here. But but even though, so I'm doing some interesting things in my house. So what? What matters is not my house. What matters is that other people do interesting things in their house too. That people's houses become places of conviviality, places of conversation. That part of what I put in a room is there for people to look at and go like, what is that? And that's a conversation. And that's what we need. We need this to go
in person
into the world.
Yes.
And the good news is I think there are possibilities here. And it's a question of who's going to take them, and who's going to get them offline. So one of the good things is are these different estuary conferences. And I'm really looking forward to the one in late August here not here, but in Germany. It's close enough.
Right.
But who knows? I'm getting a nice assortment of folks together, and I plan on having not estuary meetings per se, but just get together and talk with people. And I've got people now I've got one guy who's kind of a mystical Catholic. He's actually an American from Michigan, but he's also German. Mm-hmm. And I've had interesting conversations with him. I just met 3 guys from Belarusia who were like fleeing the dictatorship there. And that's really interesting. And I keep meeting people. Like I say, I'm not interested in how many. I'm interested in the quality. I'm interested in
right. That's exactly what I'm trying to struggle with now that I've graduated. Is like there's institutional opportunities, and there's more of what you're talking about, which would almost take an entrepreneurial spirit for me to actualize.
Not so much entrepreneurial as convivial. You have to. I'm good
find
a space, whether it's in your house or somewhere else, where find the thing over which people can gather and feel comfortable gathering, because that's important.
Yeah.
So did you just get a doctorate?
No, master's. Master's, yeah.
And what's your official title? What were you studying?
Well, a master's of systematic theology.
Okay.
And, I was offered a teaching position, which is very, complimentary, but I would like to see if I could go a little further with exactly what you're talking about, a L'Abri type of environment. Mm-hmm. And I'm associated with a much smaller town further north of here that we've gone to in the summer over many years. And it has a deep religious quality to it. Mm-hmm. In terms of it attracted people from Princeton Theological Seminary years ago. So you have these little cabins by a lake, but you also have these smaller cabins where people would go to write their sermons.
Right.
They're called think houses, right? So just being in a smaller community, because I know from one of my siblings that a smaller community makes things happen more easily sometimes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There are always difficulties. And I find the more we try, I understand the need for intentional communities, but the more intentional sometimes sounds like almost clinical. It sounds like, we're going to have an intention.
Clinical, or you can get a little cult-like too, right?
Exactly. Where my feeling is, and this is what I told this guy during the question and answers about small town, and this relates back to L'Abri, is I often thought if it wasn't for the Swiss and their 3-month rule, people would have stayed here, just chosen to stay in the general area. Not all go to the same church, not all necessarily be Christians, whatever, but all be there because of the conversation. So I only have 1 minute and 30 seconds left.
Okay. Well, that's it.
I want to thank you. I suspect I accidentally sent off this into the universe. So I will summarize if I have to.
Right. And I actually, if you could do me a kindness and show it to me before you post it in case I have said anything.
Okay. Very good.
I really appreciate that.
Well, Laura, thanks for agreeing to come on my channel.
Yes.
And even if this is only half of it,
yes,
it'll be
make the best of it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
So there you are. Our conversation with Laura Hartigan. Some interesting topics covered in this, and I think the idea of community comes out among others. And it's something I think a lot of people are thinking about, that and education, how to connect with reality in a time when everything has become abstract, virtual, unreal. Well, as the Georgians say, drobi, which means just for a while, we will see each other again. Thanks for hanging out with us, and remember, Anadromous means swimming against the stream. Don't go along with the stream. As G.K. Chesterton said, a dead thing floats with the stream. Only something living can swim against it.
People without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.